Just because I can doesn't mean my need is as important as yours. If all the business you did was only in the community that you lived in and you had to face the people that you did business with every day, I just think you would be more ethical in how you did business.
So I guess in ancient Rome, the story goes that private firefighters should show up as your house was burning and negotiate the price to put out your fire in your house with you. So I think we can all agree that's not a good system. That violates the acting under duress.
If you're on a boat that's going down and you were to be like, well, I can pay for a life raft for myself and I don't want anyone else on it. Just because you bought the presidential suite on the cruise ship doesn't mean you get one life raft all to yourself when 11 other people could be on there with you. This is an economic concept, right? I think on the one extreme of it is like zero government involvement all the way through to like heavy-handed government involvement.
My take, and I guess what kind of triggered me to want to do this was there's been a lot of conversation recently, not only with the recent disasters in Los Angeles, but also you had this during the election, right? You had it with when big news when Wendy's decided to introduce dynamic pricing last year with they just got the wheels pulled out from under them. And so I just thought everything that I see and read on that, it just feels like the political is the wrong lens to look at it. Like it seems to quickly devolve into red team, blue team. And it just seems to be the wrong level of analysis. Very easy to be like, oh, those evil people over there are trying to take advantage of you, right? And having a more long drawn out conversation is more difficult in that environment. But I think that there's economic arguments, but I think even if you understand the economic arguments, I think depending upon your ethical or moral view, you can knowing the same economic facts, you could potentially come to very different justifications for what should happen in particular circumstances. And I think that's kind of goes without saying.
And I should clarify, when I mean like liberal versus conservative, I mean like liberal versus conservative economics, right? So like there are economists that lean on the side of, do you let the market fully free flow and play and just see what happens kind of thing and let the free market kind of make its decisions? Or do you believe that there needs to be a somewhat corrective hand in play? And that's just like philosophically a different belief. And like politics aside, it's just like your perspective on the economics. And then there's also from like, if you put on the business owner hat, like the fiduciary obligation on the short versus long term, which is to me, like that's where the ethics and morality comes in, right? Okay, I have the opportunity to make more money in this moment. So one could argue as a fiduciary obligation, I have a responsibility to my shareholders to make as much money as possible. And so I have to take advantage of this opportunity. But then you have the aspect of, well, long term, if that hurts my reputation, if it hurts my business's brand to do that, then is that the long-term right financial opportunity? And how do I weigh those things, right? So there's all these different elements that you can kind of play with. And the question being like the ethics and morality of it, is it a purely like emotional thing, or does it actually have an actual business value that you can start to calculate? And does that need to be part of the calculus that you make? Right.
Yeah. Well, I think you're pointing at something that I was thinking about the last few days too, which is just at a high level, we're talking about price gouging, right? And that is a term that's thrown around even in situations where it probably does not technically apply. There are laws in the books that define price gouging. Unfortunately, they're at all state level. There's like 35 of them I saw from my research. So they all define it differently. That has pragmatic implications, right? Because if you're a just mom and pop store owner, right? You're like, well, I don't even understand like what I'm supposed to do in this situation, but I might be legally liable, right? And expecting everyone to kind of be able to read between the lines on all these things is difficult. But so there's things like you mentioned, right? Have a fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value. Part of that might be to maximize profit, but the P&L profit isn't the only, right? It's revenue minus cost, but it's not only the fixed costs, there's also real social costs, right? So we see that a lot playing out. And actually some of the debates, some of the things I've listened to, et cetera, over the last few weeks have hinted at this. But I guess my goal is, can someone kind of walk away from this conversation with a little bit more nuanced understanding of how all these sort of things are fitting together versus just red team, blue team, right? And so,
totally.
so one of these arguments, right, is so as it pertains to something like the LA wildfires, they're saying like, okay, hey, we should have a very public conversation And I actually seen there's all those terrible reality shows in LA, like Selling Sunset and stuff. So apparently like those people are now getting interviewed because you're seeing rent prices go up. And what's happening is that group of realtors is tracking what people are doing and saying, okay, now we know who you are. Like, we're not going to do anything now, but also in the future, like we all talk with each other. We know who you are as a person and whether or not we want to deal with you. And that's a real cost, right? That you have to take against as well, not just your sort of dollars and cents. And so I think that there's, as we play this out, right, it's okay, like there's the legal framework, there's a political framework, there's the economic framework, right? But then and we may be trying to approach things with government action or with legal statutes that try to put into the law what is essentially a moral claim about how people should be, but also even without those social costs, it could be very right to have those regardless, right? But those have to be part of the calculation.
So maybe just for the sake of the average listener, we should at least generally define price gouging and maybe talk about a little bit of like the major arguments pro and against, so that there's at least some like foundational coverage. And then we can talk about, okay, sure, but let's make this more tactical, right? Like, let's think about this. Because one of the things you and I were kind of like writing notes about was like, well, how do you define a pricing strategy in this regard, right? Like, how would you recommend someone to price when this is happening? And I think that's where you get into this aspect of, well, short versus long term. If you're truly like price gouging, as far as I've seen in most of them, is defined by like during an emergency, right? So that there's
I've got a pretty clean set of definitions. So
so
price gouging involves three factors universally. So price deemed unfairly high, an emergency or difficult situation, a product or service useful in responding to the emergency. Those are kind of across the board, at least what's consistent. And then as it pertains to specific laws, they can be more restrictive, sometimes defining one of these three factors more clearly. So like a price increase in excess of some predefined threshold, like a percent, like it can't be more than 10% the going market rate before or something like that. A declared state of emergency, because you may say, oh, my house is on fire, this is an emergency. But if the governor or the president hasn't declared a state of emergency, that could be ambiguous. And then a specific set of necessary or useful products or services. So you may say things like rent or lodging in general. You may say things like gasoline or ice or water, right? Things that are, the government may explicitly outline those. Because without something like, for example, the first definition of an excess of some threshold, some of these state laws are written in a way that says things like unconscionable price increases, right? Or unreasonable, right? And so you're left to imagine what is in the mind of some bureaucrat when they said that, right? And you as the individual actor in the economy is completely at a loss for what I think is reasonable.
A step further there is that if you wanted to sue that business, it is on the burden of proof of you to prove that it is an unreasonable price increase. So from a lawsuit standpoint, that type of language also makes it incredibly hard to sue someone. There's those nuances too, which is like, again, like we don't want to talk politics, but that's where some of that gets into of like, how does this favor or not favor a business in terms of how things are defined? The more something is defined, the easier, I would argue, the easier it is for both the consumer and the business to be able to operate because they have a clear set of rules. I think that's one of the things you and I talked about, right? With the whole Uber in New York, right? The kind of agreement that they came to around surge pricing, right? Uber even said at the end of it, once everything was kind of decided, they were like, we're good because now we have the rules. So we know exactly what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And we can program that into our software. And then we don't have to worry about it anymore. So that might have been lip service. Who knows? I'll take it as like at face value. And I personally could understand. I would like to not have nebulousness in what I'm doing. I like to be able to know that I've followed the rules, it's done, and now I don't have to think about this anymore. So I think like just laws in general that are very clear just make it a lot easier.
Yeah. Well, and I guess something as simple as Uber, right? So we're recording in January. We're not that far out from New Year's Eve. I saw multiple people tweet about how expensive their Ubers were on New Year's Eve. I think Uber actually invented the term, you might know better than me, of surge pricing. Otherwise, we might refer to it generally as dynamic pricing. But I think Uber may have at least popularized the term surge pricing if they didn't invent it straight out as a term. I guess take that as kind of maybe a starting place. Is that fair? Is surge pricing fair? Because some people may say, oh my God, well, $600 to take me 3 miles, and it's usually $20. That's unconscionable. How dare they?
This is why I think the whole like price gouging definition was really important, because I do not consider surge pricing to be price gouging just by definition. Like high demand does not mean an emergency situation. Now, I think that there are Venn diagram overlapping areas, right? And I think that's where the definitions, like in the Uber example, are great, because surging gets capped during an emergency situation, right? They have a set limit that you will not get surged over when that happens. But New Year's Eve, that is a pure convenience thing. There's just high demand, and it's not just that it's the demand side here, it's the supply side. There are also fewer people who want to be driving during New Year's Eve. So they have to incentivize drivers more to get on the road. So the costs also go up. So that's not purely just a demand profit increase. That is also a cost increase that happens during that time, right? Drivers get paid like 1.5x or 2x during that period. So there's a bit of like, it's pure economics at play. That makes total sense in my mind. And you're also not depriving someone of an essential service in a time of need. I don't know. Again, this is an overgeneralization, but if you decided to go to Times Square on New Year's Eve, like, I assume you kind of had a sense of what was going to be going on, right? Like, it's going to be crowded. You're probably not getting home until 5 o'clock in the morning. Subways are running or not, depending on where you're going. That's just a situation that you got yourself into. There's no earthquake happening. Like, there's no massive emergency. You're not starving. Like, it's not an emergent situation at that point. So to me, that's pure economics, and that's perfectly fair.
One way to think about kind of maybe the baseline of fair that I might put on the table, I think you got like kind of 3 criteria. So you're free to act. You're not under compulsion, right? So I don't think anyone would say, hey, I've got a gun to your head, you need to sign this contract, right? That would be a fair negotiation or a fair price, no matter what you signed, right? So you can't be under compulsion. I would say generally also compulsion is slightly different, but you're not under duress. And so I think we have a lot of precedent for this legally, where you have things like cooling off periods, because if you have like high pressure sales tactics or whatever, right? People are like, oh yeah, I signed it, but it's almost kind of viewed as a source of compulsion. It wasn't quite a gun to your head, but also you may be in a emotionally damaged state. You can imagine, I don't know, you're just in some sort of really tragic situation. You don't have your full faculties, right?
Sign anything around a claim while you're like in the hospital of a car crash, for instance, highly unethical, under duress, not in the right state of mind, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And then I think maybe the last would be there's equal or at least not unfair asymmetric information. Yeah. So I think if I was to kind of push back a little bit on, I think where at least I saw Uber get in trouble, even in something like just a New Year's Eve situation, not even an emergency situation, was something around like not equal information, but being sort of forthright with the information.
Sure.
Where like they used to have sort of some flows, if I recall, it's been some years since they've actually adjusted this. I think now you have to click 3 times. Like, I know I'm in a 6x surge area. Yes,
So now it's transparent that like we're currently experiencing surge pricing by X amount or whatever it is. So now you have perfect information to be like, you are choosing that. That is totally on you.
Whereas before you may have been able to sneak that in the fine print of, yes, your normal $20 ride is going to be $500.
I don't even think there was fine print. When it originally was the case, it was just a price. They just calculated a price and just slapped it on it. And your normal like $20 Uber was like $200 suddenly. And that was the big thing. Let's be clear here. It was because people were, let's just put it, not in their right mind when they made that decision, right? That's often what would happen. Like, they were in a different state of consciousness. They would make the purchase, not paying too much attention.
They've been meditating all day, right? They've been meditating all day.
They were purely in this like pure trance of meditation. And then the following day, when they groggily look at their bill, they're like, why did I pay $200 for an Uber? And that's the flack that Uber was getting, right? And then they started being more transparent about it. And I think that had some impact, obviously, too, where I'm sure they see a massive reduction in people taking rides during that piece. But I think they also saw less backlash.
So that's the New Year's Eve case. And I think we're generally on the same page there. What you were hinting at earlier, where they got in trouble by the attorneys in New York was during an emergency. It was like a blizzard or a hurricane, I don't remember which it was. And then they ended up having to, along these price gouging laws, they had this cap no more than, it was like 3x or 4x what had been in the previous 24 hours or something like that during one of these emergency periods. And so I guess, ultimately, is that fair or effective in your mind?
I think the question becomes going back to a couple pieces of the definition, right? So an emergency has been set. I think there is a question mark around how essential of a service something like Uber is. And the question is, are there alternatives? So in the case, I think it was during Sandy that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it was because there was massive flooding. So a lot of subway stations were down. So people could not take their normal modes of transportation. And so Uber, taxi, etc. became an essential mode of transportation around and out of the city. I would say in that scenario, it fits all of the definitions that you outlined, and it makes sense. I think depending on what the emergency is, that may be more or less true, but that's kind of hard to say, like, for these emergencies, it's okay, and for these, it's not. So I think you kind of just have to take a generalized take of if an emergency is declared, then like those are the rules. But I think this is one of the things we haven't talked about, which is duration. Right? Because
I don't think we've talked about duration at all.
Right. Because in this type of situation, and this to me is where price gouging becomes more of a thing versus if my costs go up 100% for a couple of days, right? To be able to continue to provide this service to the community that I am in, that I usually make a lot of money off of or whatever it is, like that's one thing. Versus if I'm saying, oh, this is going to last for months. That's a very different scenario as a business, right? I might be able to eat a couple days. I can't eat it for months. And so I think the problem there is where you start seeing the situation where, oh, I have this very narrow window of an opportunity to skyrocket my profits and take advantage of this, even though my costs are completely the same. That's where things get ethically kind of weird to me versus where it's, hey, I don't know, infrastructure or whatever is damaged for the next 6 months. So people are going to have to take Uber for the next 6 months, more so than they ever would. Well, my costs are going up for providing that for the next 6 months. That's not a short blip. That's a pretty insignificant impact to my P&L. So I feel like at that point, I need to actually figure out, like, how do I get my profits back in line? How do I figure this out? So I think there's a bit of also the duration does play a role here, which is something we haven't really addressed yet.
So I agree with you that it meets, and obviously Uber either settled or was found guilty. I don't remember what the outcome of the case was. They changed their behavior based upon it. So I'm assuming they came to some sort of agreement either way. But I agree with you that it meets the test of potentially that particular New York law of price gouging. I guess the question, and this is where I think that, as I was hinting at before, a lot of the debate is not really gone there, is, okay, well, does that remedy make sense? Does that actually benefit society, right, and the participants in that market more so than just saying, oh, they're price gougers and they need to change their behavior? Because if we think about things like, what you were saying before, right, we're using the New Year's Eve example. Uber's got to get more drivers on the road. All of a sudden, there's a bunch of demand. Supply and demand are out of whack. So price is being used as a signal to temper demand. So only people who value that ride the most are going to pay that price at that, because otherwise they'll sort of opt out of the market. But then also to bring more supply in. And so by the government stepping in and saying, hey, we're going to artificially restrain the price mechanism, like you're dampening, I guess one way to think about prices is an information signal. Analogy I might use is something like when you have pain in your body that says, ow, that hurts. Okay, now I need to go have the doctor take a look at it. Or maybe I cut myself, or I gotta make sure I stop hitting myself in the face, whatever it might be, right? It's a signal that attention needs to be paid to that area, and price would act much the same way, where we say, hey, this area requires attention to encourage supply to that place. And so the question then is, by the government stepping in, are you effectively maximizing overall welfare? Because there otherwise will just be a shortage, because if there wasn't, then the price level wasn't capped high enough, right?
Two things there. I would say it's important that we don't conflate willingness with ability to pay. Because if Ubers are suddenly $1,000 a ride, There's a very small group of people that can afford that. And of that group, there may be a group that literally doesn't even mean anything to their personal wealth, right? And so I think let's not conflate those two things, because there may be a huge amount of willingness, but a lack of ability. And so I think that's where the government stepping in usually comes into play, right? Is because when these rides start to escalate, and we can move away from Uber, but
Yeah.
toilet paper, water, whatever, if that starts to skyrocket to a place where people who need something cannot physically afford it, but it's still something they need, right? The example they always talk about is if I have unlimited wealth and you have limited wealth, and I go out and buy a bunch of ice, and I can pay $1,000 a pound for ice, and you can't afford that, but you need it to keep your insulin cold or you will die, and I'm buying it to host a party, right? Like, just because I can doesn't mean my need is as important as yours. And so I think that's where this becomes the ethically tricky piece, right? Is you have to actually consider the application of what we're using these things for. That's kind of on the demand side. On the supply side, I get your point of you want to be creating more supply, and that is a really good signal that, hey, there's a lot of demand for this, so I can make the supply. But here I would argue there's two pieces to that. There's price and then there's volume. I picked a price, say $5 for a bag of ice, where I was making a profit I was cool with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so say I produce other water-based products, and suddenly you're saying, oh, the volume demand for ice has tripled. So the only way I can meet that supply is to triple my price. No, the aspect is if I triple my price, I can make more by only supplying the same volume. The additional demand has not been met. There is still 2x demand that is now going without. The other option is I could just choose to supply way more ice, right? I'm still making the same profit that I was making before, that as a business I was okay with. I was in that business for 20 years making ice at that profit margin, and that was fine. I could make a lot of profit dollars simply producing.
Well, but I think that your costs potentially change tremendously, right? Because this is a similar argument. People, ice works, but also gasoline, right? So hurricane hits an area, and all of a sudden the price of gasoline spikes incredibly, right? But that's not just because a bunch of greedy gas station owners. It's because oftentimes there's increased costs to resupply those in a disaster zone, right? Supply lines get disrupted, right?
That's not the issue though, right?
Well, it's certainly an issue.
Oh, for sure. But if your costs are going up, then I don't think there's anything wrong with driving up your price. That makes total sense. I think when people talk about price gouging and things like that, it's the cost to provide this service has stayed the exact same to you. You have no additional issue of making supply, or costs have not changed. You are pure, like the one we talked about, the hotel example. Offering you that room does not cost me anything else. That room's cost to provide has been exactly the same one night to the next. I've just chosen to triple the price of the room, right? There was always a finite supply. I was never going to be able to have more. I was okay with the profit that I was making off of the room yesterday. But because there's now 5x more people who want the room, I'm willing to increase my cost on my price.
So I think that's probably a fundamental consideration there, right? When I hear these arguments, there's often are we dividing a fixed pie, or is price a signal that actually expands the pie itself? Because when we were talking about the Uber example earlier, right, you're saying, well, the price goes up, that encourages more drivers to come on the roads, because New Year's Eve, we got all of a sudden this spike in demand, right? And so you're bringing new supply online. In that case, it's not just, hey, all these greedy Uber drivers or taxi cab drivers, whoever, are already on the road, there's not going to be any more on the road. We're actually, like, that mechanism is actually encouraging more supply to come online. So bringing it to something like Los Angeles, right, where they're talking about like hotel rooms or places for rent, right, for housing. There's no, I guess this is where it gets tricky, because you've got something like Airbnb, right? So people, a lot of LA single family homes, there's a significant chance that there are probably people who may have an extra room or may have a couch, right? And yeah, of course they could just say, hey, put a sign in their front yard or on Craigslist saying, hey, we're willing to take in some people. Or they could say, hey, like this actually happens quite a bit. I'll use not a non-disaster scenario, but so I live in Austin. Every year in Austin during March, we have South by Southwest.
Right.
Austin's really increased its hotel capacity over the years, so this is tempered down a little bit. And also COVID kind of smashed the demand side of South by Southwest in 2020, which wasn't fun. It's building back up though. But I have friends who live around downtown, and if you rent your place out, if you live within a relative, say, a mile of downtown of activities, you can pretty much make all of your year's rent by renting your place out for 2 weeks. Right. There becomes a point where you're like, I will leave Austin during the peak of this festival, like in a really prime area to be, because I can make my entire rent. Right. So that supply is coming online because of that price signal. And so in a disaster, when you artificially cap it, like you remove that incentive. Right. So then I think the argument somehow turns to, well, that people are all greedy and everyone should just be opening their doors to everyone, and everyone who doesn't do that is bad. And so I think one of the papers I was looking at before this conversation was trying to understand, look, is it to say somebody should not be able to charge a market clearing price for a good? Is that ethically worse than not bringing that supply on at all? Because a lot of us will sit there and look at a disaster or look at whatever people in need and just not do anything, right? We go on with our lives, right? There's disasters happening all the way around the world, right?
Totally.
That's effectively what the government is doing, is saying, hey, well, okay, like we're going to prevent transactions from happening, which basically is then, okay, everyone's sitting on the sidelines. Is that worse than two people coming together to transact under what is in their mutual best interest, right? And then the question is, okay, is it coercive? Is it exploitative? Different sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it comes down to, there's so many points here. So one, someone renting out their apartment, that's not their primary business. That's something they're only going to do in an extreme scenario where there's suddenly a lot of money to be made, right? The people that in your South by example, they're not doing that every week. Like, they're not landlords, right? They're doing that on a random short-term situation because there's a very high spike, right? And your argument is during emergencies, well, if we let that happen, more people might enter a business, which is basically, we go back to the ice example. I could start selling ice. If I could make $20 a pound of ice, I'll just let my ice machine run all day and just start bagging and selling ice, right? So you'll have people short term enter a market that has nothing to do with what they do. I think one of the things we talked about was like the hand sanitizer situation, right? Where like alcohol companies were entering into making sanitizer off of ethanol because they could, and they had the supplies and they could make money off of it. And that was good because we needed a lot of hand sanitizer, right? So you have these things where people might enter a business for the short term. And I think where we need a lot of supply, I think that is a decent answer to that. I think where things get tricky is when there is a finite supply that you can provide, and you then let the price go to an area where only a very small number of people have access to it, right? Because then you're basically cutting people off. And then I do think, again, and this is ethical, there's no like easy way to draw this distinction. But then if we go back to the aspect of like me using ice for a party versus you using ice for insulin, it's very hard to regulate that, right? If I'm willing to pay $1,000 for a bag of ice because I want to keep my champagne cold, and the price of ice is $1,000, but you're dying because you can't afford the ice to keep your insulin cold, like, how do we deal with that? There is no easy way to deal with that. So the fact of the matter is, the only way we can kind of do that is to say, yeah, is it super fair? Is it the best option? No. But if we put some form of cap in place, at least we know that the person who needs the ice to literally survive will be able to keep access to it.
Well, I think
and just to finish that thought, the duration piece, again, is why I think that's important. Because if it's going to be only a very short amount of time, you're not going to expect a whole person to create a whole new manufacturing facility to provide ice to this county or whoever is in danger, right? Now, if this disaster is going to last for 6 months, maybe. And that's what we saw with the hand sanitizer situation, right? Like, people adjusted their manufacturing lines and their bottling procedures to create hand sanitizer when they previously weren't, because that was going to be a long-term duration thing. If it was only going to be for a week, I can guarantee you none of those liquor companies would have done it. It wouldn't have made sense. It would have taken them too long to get to that to be able to make any money off of it.
So is your point that, like, in those situations, a legal limitation on the price should be capped at a short duration?
I would say that, like, if you're having a
pragmatic
disaster scenario, like, price increases should be limited for, say, maybe the first 2 weeks or whatever it is, right? I don't know what the right number is. But, like, if a scenario is going to extend for months, then I think you have to start loosening that. Because one, I think businesses will not be able to eat the increased cost that they themselves will be facing for a long period of time. And I think two, there's only so much additional supply that the existing supply chain can provide. So either, which this isn't something we've talked about, but this happens all the time, right? The government has to step in and be a supplier, which can happen, and that does happen, right? Like the government will come in with food, with water, with other resources to help fill the supply need that the existing suppliers cannot provide. Or they need to encourage, again, if this is going to be long term, they need to encourage other people to enter that market to provide more supply.
So, well, I guess because there's a couple of different areas of like pragmatism, because it wasn't lost to me before when you were talking about the sort of difference between willingness to pay and ability to pay. That totally makes sense. The question is, and I think this gets kind of more into the less the ethical and more the pragmatism of encoding these in laws, because if we believe that all things being equal, we've sort of realized that, yes, while there's not a perfect way to determine someone trying to ice their cocktail or their insulin, price in a free market economy tends to go follow that which is most highly valued. There's scarce resources. Price is a signal that allows us to give those or allocate those resources where they're most needed, given they could be put a lot of different places. And I think a beautiful example with the ethanol hand sanitizer example is sort of repurposing one good for the other. But in that situation, right, ability to pay, willingness to pay, is the damage from limiting price as a signal and saying, hey, seller, like it's the government coming in and saying, hey, buyers and sellers, we know better than you what is the fair transaction to be had in this market, right? Even though both of you, like we usually don't have that in almost any other situation in the free market economy. We know what this price should be, and we're not going to let you transact at the price that otherwise would freely enter into. And again, that has benefits of being a signal to the broader supply and demand side of the economic equation. Whereas government instead could do something like you were talking about before, right? Where they could come in and become a supplier, right, at whatever price, or they could come in and say, kind of do what FEMA does now, right, to a certain extent, which is say, hey, like, you get to, we'll provide you economic recovery funds. Mm-hmm. Go out there, get your hotel room, buy your groceries. There's always going to be some dead weight loss here, right? So it's okay. Now I've got delays in payments, right? So imagine the federal government used Venmo and they could just Venmo you immediately, right? But buy your groceries, rent your hotel room, right? And the government will subsidize people who kind of most need it most because you have an income level, right? Mm-hmm. So they can kind of direct that, but you don't lose out on the signal for what the price mechanism is, because I think this has real world consequences as well, right? You've got multiple market interventions that have caused failures, everything from fire insurance not being able to rise to proper rates to the fire insurance companies needing to leave the state. You've got, and then this idea of, hey, we want to maximize how fast these communities can rebuild, but we're also going to limit the price of building materials and what contractors can charge, right? Where those would be potential signals for people to be like, hey, like I'm a plumber in Indiana and my business is a little slow, but they got a bunch of plumbing work they need in Southern California right now as they're sort of doing all this new construction. So it's worth it for me to transplant my life for a couple of years and go live in a tent in someone's backyard, like go rebuild all this stuff, right? And so and then so I guess that's more on the pragmatic side, right?
I think the problem here winds up being is that whenever you do any form of legislation, it has to be broad. It has to cover everything. And the problem is that oftentimes what that winds up meaning is that you'll have a few bad actors that wind up resulting in legislation being a lot harder than it needs to be. I can guarantee you, I'll take a rough guess, but it's 10% of Uber drivers on New Year's Eve sit there waiting. I guarantee you that that's a thing. Mm-hmm. Like, I have a friend who drives for Uber. He does that sometimes. Yeah. When he's like, I know when prices go up, I'm going to wait until that happens. And there are entire threads on Reddit of Uber and Lyft drivers who talk about it, of we're all going to wait until this time where they're basically colluding. That's price collusion, where they literally, we're not going to go on the app until they double the rates, and then we'll go on the app. And then they'll have 1 hour of like really high pay, and then they'll go offline again, and they'll wait another hour, and then they'll do it again. And that's them artificially pushing the price up by managing supply. That is a thing people do.
As a blanket statement, price collusion is wrong. Yes. I have no qualms, right? Because price collusion fundamentally breaks the free market supply demand economies, right?
100.
And as soon as you're colluding on supply or demand, right, it just totally breaks all these
And here,
arguments.
just to be clear, like I think 90% of Uber drivers are probably just like, yeah, I'm gonna go out. I like do this every night. I like, oh nice, I get to make a little bit more money tonight. Or I wasn't really planning on going out tonight, but I see the rates are higher, so I'll go out. That to me is probably 90% of Uber drivers. But my guess is that there's a small subset that manipulate this a little bit. And because of that, things go out of whack pretty extreme and trends start to form. And then a third party winds up having to step in to be like, well, we can't do this. This does not work. I think you're going to have contractors who are going to be like, meh, I'll wait an extra week. They'll get more desperate and then I can charge them twice as much. Or I'm going to wait until I get 4 more offers and then I can drive up this bid. And that's always going to be part of it, where it's not, oh, I'm driving up my price because I literally can't keep up with demand. It's, I know the demand is out there. I'm just going to wait. And they're going to hold on supply. And that gets into the whole concept of hoarding and inventory management, where people are like, I make a lot of water. There's a disaster happening. I'm going to wait for a week because my loss of sales of this week are going to be more than made up by the fact that I'll be able to sell it for 5 times the price next week. So I think that's where you get into these situations where it becomes highly unethical. And I think if you don't put a cap on that, there is an inherent incentive for me to be like, yeah, I'll just wait. I'll just wait.
I mean, I could take the other side of that argument because I guess there's a couple of different things in that little scenario you painted there. So one is, as a pragmatic concern, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea for, I think, as versus price gouging laws as are currently illuminated, it wouldn't be a bad idea for governments to create incentives for people to stockpile, for vendors to stockpile goods that are needed in case of an emergency before
Agreed.
an emergency happens. I actually think that could be very valuable, right? It's just imagine you're a gas station owner. You've got your regular storage tanks, right? You could increase capacity, but that's going to be a capital expense. You only need that. The government could subsidize that, right? But then you have more supply available, exactly. Right? And I think this is an economic argument that always makes my head spin when I try to wrap my head around it. When you are making a pricing decision, your relevant variable cost is not the cost of the inventory when you paid for it, but your opportunity cost. It's a cost of it's your replacement cost. Yeah. So you may have and this again goes back to, is this person like in business continuously, or is this sort of a person who just started up to take advantage of a particular situation? Because you basically have a paper gain on your P&L, assuming you span the time, like I sold the good and the price rose. But like the next period, I'm going to be like, it's going to be the exact inverse because all my inventory is going to be at X price higher because that's what things cost to get me there on the next period, if that makes sense. So in those situations, right, I don't necessarily, it can be overall welfare maximizing that somebody had excess supply, right? Like you hope your hardware store stocked up on shovels before a snowstorm, right? Because you don't want to walk in there and be like, oh yeah, we don't have any shovels. Like, I guess.
Well, let's be very clear. There's a difference between stocking up before an event versus not supplying during part of the event to be able to drive the price up, i.e. artificially reducing supply. That's different.
Okay.
Yes. I totally agree. There may be cases, or I love the shovel and the blizzard example. You know that snowstorms are coming every year. You live in the Northeast. You run a store in the Northeast. So yes, I'm going to over order an inventory of shovels because normally I have like 2 in the store. So I'm going to get like 50 before November just to make sure that I have enough for the influx. Totally makes sense. Seasonal variability in sales is a totally normal thing, and preparing for that makes sense. When you are like, what's a good example? I don't know. We'll think like water, right? If you sell bottles of water and you're like, oh, I'm normally ship out 100,000 cases every week to retailers. For this next week, I'm only going to ship out 20,000. And because things are starting to move in a certain direction. So I'm going to limit how much I'm sending out in the early days of this issue and then send out and basically stockpile extra volume. So that once prices hit a higher point, which I know they're going to, then I'm going to drop it into the market. But that means you basically deprived the market when it needed it initially to create a higher demand surge quickly so that the prices rose much faster than they would have. And that to me feels weird.
That does feel weird. That also implies some amount of market power that I don't think is necessarily in line with what people think. There's an interesting argument, as I was kind of doing some reading in preparation for this, There's an interesting argument, right? That like we're talking about fairness to buyers, right? And that's usually how price gouging laws are framed. But there's a whole set of arguments around fairness to sellers, and actually, what do those laws impact the most? So if we look at, say, the hurricanes in Florida or North Carolina or anything like that, you often have a increase in direct costs for local small vendors. So think of a mom and pop hardware store where their supply chains are entirely disrupted. That replacement cost we were talking about before, it goes through the roof. They don't really have a bunch of options. Whereas maybe you have a Walmart, they've got an international distribution save, no problems. And so Walmart, maybe to keep their margin perfectly in line, can increase price 2%, whereas the mom and pop, because their costs changed significantly more, have to break even, have to increase it 20, 50%. And all of a sudden, it's like the mom and pop retailer who looks like, oh, they're the evil price gouger, when it's not actually, they're under net circumstances because their underlying economics aren't shared equally. And
here's the thing though, and feel free to prove me wrong, but like I would love for you to find a like Twitter thread or something that is actually about a mom and pop shop price gouging. Because usually what happens in a local community is that's exactly what will happen, but Walmart won't increase by 2%. They'll also increase by 50% because the local demand has set that price and they're just following along and they can. That's usually what happens, and that's the piece that pisses people off, not the fact that Mary and Sue increased their hardware stores prices. Right. So I think it's worth noting there.
There are examples. I don't remember exactly what the name of the company was. There was a small gas station chain or a small grocery store chain that happened. It was in one of the Southeast, in one of these hurricane afflicted regions. And it was kind of exactly that situation where they got, eventually they settled because it's like they're getting taken to court by the attorney general of their state. Right. And then there's, all right, fine. But it wasn't invented out of whole cloth, but we have to kind of look at that.
And that's totally fair. But I think I said earlier, if your costs are marginally changing, to me, that is not an unfair reaction to drive up prices. To me, that does not. That's why one of the things I don't really love about it is when they talk about like prices can't increase. I think it would make way more sense that like profits can't increase. Like to me, that would be a more logical way of doing this, is to say, if you traditionally are providing water and your profit margin is 15% on that, you can't suddenly go to 80% during a disaster scenario. That I think doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if your costs are increasing, you should be able to make at least the 10 to 15% you were making before. So if that means you have to drive up your price to meet your cost increases, I think that's fair. So I think that's maybe more, and to your point, like we still want to encourage supply. So if you can make a little bit more profit, then that might still increase that supply aspect of it. But I think limiting the profit aspect versus the revenue aspect makes way more sense.
Yeah, I think this is where the pragmatism, right? It's what can we kind of monitor and control across all businesses?
Very hard.
At the state level,
very,
right?
very hard.
It's nearly impossible. But I think what you're pointing to, though, I completely agree, because where you're pointing to is kind of we've been using a lot of sort of natural disaster type scenarios, but obviously we've gone through some historic 50-year inflation recently. And then that was a big part of the 2024 election cycle, was like, oh, look at these grocers who are price gouging us for eggs, et cetera, right? And then you look at these grocery store chains and they've got like a 4% profit margin.
Yes.
You're like, it's not the grocery store's fault. I mean, I would love if it was. That would be the easiest fix in the world. But, it's okay, prices are up, but prices are up across the board. It's always funny because it comes from the government and you're just like, who did this? Who made all these prices go up?
One thing I will say that I wanted to call out is when you were talking about like the FEMA and the assistance in terms of being able to give you reimbursements and like ignoring the like systematically horrible way that those are operated and executed on. Let's just assume it was perfect and you would like, as soon as you spend the money, you get it in your bank account. I think, are you a subscriber of Lenny's? Yeah.
I've heard his podcast, but I'm not a subscriber.
He has the coolest pricing for his newsletter. It's monthly, $10 a month. It's annually, $100 for the year. Or is your business paying for this $300 for the year? Literally no different. It's just if your company is paying for it and you want to give me some money, I'll charge you $300 instead. Literally the only difference is you're putting it on a corporate card. And that is a thing. Right? Like people, if I business travel on company expense versus personal travel, like my willingness to pay is different because I'm not footing the bill, right? I have a different economic consideration. I'm like, I have to land there at a certain time. I have to be fresh for a meeting. I like need to give myself certain benefits during the trip. So I'm like willing to spend more for that versus if it's like myself, I'm like, whatever, I can be a little tired when I go hang out with my buddy. That's not a big deal. My concern is that oftentimes in a disaster scenario, when people know you're not actually footing the bill for this, like the government's footing your bill, that people aim to potentially take advantage of that. And the thing is, that's taxpayer money at that point, right? So at that point, we're bleeding extra tax dollars to pay for things because businesses know that they can take advantage of that situation. Again, I'm not saying every business, I'm not saying everyone does that, but like it's enough of a thing that I know it does happen. And so in that case, I wonder if like simply reimbursing or paying the bill is the right answer, because that seems like a system that can very much be taken advantage of, versus if you, and this, the thing is, this is harder to do with certain things than others, but if the Engineering Corps of America comes up and sets up temporary housing that they say they even charged rent for it, right? So that like it was at cost, so it didn't actually cost anything to provide it, but they were setting a certain threshold of, you could go to this hotel that's now charging you $1,000 a night, which used to be $100 a night, or you can go to the FEMA location, which is only $100 a night. That definitely limits how much the hotel can charge, because you just created a bunch of supply. It's not free. There is still a market cost to it in the space, so we can at least make the money back or break even on it to a certain extent. But it would help regulate supply and thus also regulate pricing.
Yeah, I think what's kind of coming up to me as you're talking, right? And so we've kind of ignored the very low end of this, right? Because the price gouging is all capping sort of maximum price, right? And so I could just hear somebody like listening to this say, being like, well, like what about people who have no money? Kind of going back to your ability to pay. They just lost their house. That's everything that they have, right? They only had their house,
now. Yeah.
right? They own nothing, right? They don't have credit cards, right? They're debanked or unbanked, whatever. And look, I think the government absolutely has a role to sort of create a floor, right? Because there's a large chunk of people who like, but we're talking kind of at the high end, right? But there's absolutely a role for them to come in. They turn every stadium into a shelter, right? And just set up camps, right? So with shelters, right, that bring in the National Guard, right, to deliver food and meals, right? And I don't think that any part of our conversation, I guess, from my perspective, I just assume that is a net good and that should be going on. I guess it's on this price limiting aspect
But I think they play a role together though, right? Because there have been different levels of success in FEMA response.
You're doing a heck of a job, Brownie.
Right? Like it's just not always the same, for better or for worse, right? And I think part of it is that, just as an example, yes, you can provide free housing to those who absolutely cannot afford it and who have nothing. But in my mind, if you had like a good, better, best option for housing that the government was providing you in a situation where a lot of housing just went up in flames, literally, you have a huge demand and a lack of supply, and the government came in with different levels of cost based on your income. They're basically just becoming a supplier in the market for the short term.
Well, that's what the ACA did, right?
Yeah.
Except there was no official government option. They just set up the marketplace and then defined the levels of plans that could be.
But that's kind of in my mind of, if there's a resource that is highly demanded and needed, instead of telling a business like, oh, you can't charge this or anything like that, if the government just comes in as a low-cost supplier, as an alternative, then it's just, hey, we're just making sure that there's enough supply here, because that way they're just making the market competitive, right? That's all they're really doing. And that way they're saying, like, you don't have to take on the burden of unnecessary supply for a short duration of time. You don't have to mess with what you're doing. We're just trying to regulate demand by keeping it in a natural place by providing the additional supply. That would be one option. The other one is what we talked about, which is we will subsidize you creating more supply so that your costs stay low, which means you theoretically don't have an incentive to drive up your price because your cost has now come down to create additional supply. And we've helped you flood the market yourself. The one thing I like about the government coming in as a supplier, not as a free supplier, important, by charging for something, is that it's not a net out cost of taxpayer dollars. Like subsidizing a business to do it means that we're net losing taxpayer dollars in that regard.
Well, we have a model for that, right? I mean, city bus, right? City bus run by a city municipality,
totally.
Right? Yeah. It's transportation. There's a cost to it. You can get discount if you're senior or a student. Right?
Exactly. Sense is, in a situation like that, there's arguably like one of the benefits, but let's talk purely theoretically, as an institution, like the Army Corps of Engineers is very good at coming in, setting up construction sites and building things very rapidly, probably better than any construction company in the United States, and being able to do that and deploy resources really quickly into a very specific location, right? In certain scenarios, like if we actually did that operationally well and efficiently, the government could literally come in, be a supplier for a very short amount of time just to have regulate demand, keep everything flowing, and then get the hell out of Dodge again once it's done. Any other business would have to make serious investment to do that. And that just takes time. That would distract from other things, and that could potentially gump up supply chains and other problems. I like that as at least an option, and I would love to see it tried. It's just not something I think we've seen a lot of. And so it'd be interesting to see how that could actually work.
Yeah. Well, at one point, I can't remember where I was hearing this discussion, but we haven't kind of touched on directly without sort of, there was, as it pertains to the Southern California wildfires, like one of the policies that has been enacted or was at least talked about being enacted was buyers of properties are restricted from making unsolicited below market offers to people who are in the disaster zone. And so one real strong rationale for that, because it's like, there's one argument I think you could make almost, there probably will be a court case if it does get challenged on free speech grounds, like who's the government come in and tell me that I can't talk to another person about
Right.
a business transaction at all, right? Even if we don't consummate it, like there's what legal grounds you have to stand on. But besides that, I think going back to the kind of very beginning of the conversation I was talking about, probably at least 3 core tenets you need for a fair transaction is that the person kind of equal information, they're free to act, they're not under compulsion, but also they're not under duress, right? And so I could very easily imagine a scenario where someone, whatever, you have one of these offers come in, you're in sort of a temporary housing, trying to figure out your kid's schooling, you're trying to deal with the insurance company, right? You've got all these things that are sort of in flight, and someone comes in and says, hey man, yeah, you could probably rebuild, but that'll take you 3-5 years. Plus you got to wait for all the insurance paperwork to clear. I'll buy your house out from you for 80%. You walk away, I'll take care of everything, right? In that moment, that offer could look very tempting that you would probably have. Oftentimes especially doing pricing analysis, we think about sort of value maximization, but there's also regret minimization is another sort of choice model that we think of, right? Which, yeah, and this is in B2B sales, I think the largest competitor, bar none, is status quo. Like people just decide not to change because it's, oh, yeah, maybe your tool or whatever solution could actually do the job, but like people are really worried about regretting their decision. And so I think it's one of these areas where it can actually make a lot of sense, where people are under emotional duress and then they're going to have some significant regret if they were to be given a little bit more time. This is a very unique situation. There's probably something to be said about sort of time limits, duration, as you were talking about, but also could filter into these ideas we have around cooling off periods or et cetera, right? Like you would have to be able to, if you made some of that, have some sort of ability to get out of it.
Lemon law.
Yeah.
Like it's not the exact same thing, but kind of in that vein, right? Which is I buy a car from you, I have certain assumptions that we've made. And so when those assumptions don't wind up being true, there is a rule that lets me get out of it. Similarly, you could say if there are heightened aspects of duress, emotion, whatever it is, then there's a certain period through which people can back out or a deal cannot go through. It has to have a longer period of escrow time or whatever it winds up being. Like those are all things that I could see make happen. I think the thing that gets complicated, and I know that like I've been very of a certain mind during this conversation because I think it just makes for a good kind of conversation. But I do think that like it's worth noting that it sounds like very conspiracy theoristy, but there's so many examples too of it's worth noting of the same entity that owns the insurance company owns the company that's buying up land, that owns the company that runs the contracting and building supply materials. And there's a lot of situations where people are like, hey, we're not telling you this, but we're going to make your insurance process really hard because it makes it easier for us to come and make you a compelling pitch to buy your property, right? It's not ethical, but it happens. And so I think that's the other thing where, is it legal? Actually, I don't think it is, but the fines or the repercussions are so small and most people don't even know how to fight that legally. And even if you could, like you'd have to prove it, it would be really hard. There's all of these problems that come into play. And that I think is what gets me really frustrated sometimes, is because we wound up having to make all of these laws to solve for these problems that are not super common, right? Like most people will never deal with that, but they happen just enough that we have to have laws that impact everyone. And that to me is like what gets really frustrating, Because I think if people were actually, I was reading this and I want to find the phrasing, like the moral imperative in doing business as a society is like, we've kind of moved away from that because we've gotten to all of these like very large entities. But if all the business you did was only in the community that you lived in and you had to face the people that you did business with every day, like I just think you would be more ethical in how you did business. Because the people who buy from you, who keep you alive and keep food on your table by buying things from you, you deal with. They are your friends. And I think because we've had such a large like split of that, where like the person who runs a business has no idea who their people are even selling to anymore. There's just such a dissonance there that you don't feel any moral obligation to your customers anymore. And so I think that just gets made more extreme in a disaster scenario. Like, I think there's just a certain aspect of everyone needs to have kind of a general sacrifice, not because I think, oh, everyone should suffer, but it's like you're part of this community. Everyone in your community is suffering. Take part in that suffering to help other people, right? And I think it's very easy to just absolve yourself of that when you're leading a business that's so large that you're not really tied to any community anymore. So I think you just get into some of these situations where I just wish we like. So I think you just get into some of these situations where I just like I wish that there was just a little bit of more like ethical and moral connection to the communities that businesses serve, because I think a lot of these problems just wouldn't exist anymore.
No, I don't disagree. I guess one point we didn't make is that although these laws on the books are usually pretty rarely enforced, yeah, because just the cases it's small potatoes and it's usually not worth pursuing, and all the pragmatic concerns, right? And so I think there's a whole line of argument to be like, okay, even if we agree morally and ethically, every time we try to legislate morality, you end up with a cure that's worse than the original.
And that's 10 years of court battles.
Yeah. In doing some reading up on this before our conversation, I thought that what's actually happened is that more and more states have added these types of laws since the early 90s, maybe late 80s, early 90s. I think the first couple states maybe added it in the 80s, and then it was more and more. And I think now it's 30 or 35 states, and just adding and adding, right? And I don't know what that... It is an interesting trend. It surprised me as I was looking into it. I was like, oh, I kind of expected... In Texas, we have the blue laws. So there's a lot of counties in Texas where you can't buy liquor on Sundays, for example, right? And so you're like... But those are like tend to be laws that have been on the books since 1897. Forever, yeah. And so I thought like price gouging laws would be a lot like that, when actually it seems to be more of a rising trend. I don't know if that says anything about the view. Oddly.
So my understanding, having looked into them, is it says nothing about the economics, and it says everything about a whole other discussion, but global warming potentially, or climate change, because most of those laws come into effect after they happen, after a natural disaster. That's like the most common scenario where a price gouging law will come into effect, is there's some form of a natural disaster that occurs or a large emergency that occurs. Price gouging, whether it's actually defined it like actually meets the definition or not, but a perceived price gouging event occurs. There is some form of societal outrage because of it, and then government kicks into gear to respond to that. Again, whether it was actually fair or not, the perception in the outcome or the fallout of the natural disaster does that. And so that was my understanding of looking at some of the cases of like where these laws were coming from. It's just that we're having more and more of these natural disasters occur, but also in line with just social media. Like people just talk about it more, and it gets caught up in media a lot more, that people are showing examples of price gouging or complaining about it more. So I think it's, I think we talked about this before. Like there are examples of price caps and limitations that go back to like Roman times. This is not a new thing, right? This is a very old concept of minimizing demand to manage supply back in olden days. But I think the like legislation for it, at least in the United States, has picked up more and more. I think just with like social media trends picking it up post natural disasters and things like that. Maybe portraits.
Yeah, it may have to do as well with, I mean, there's obviously everything kind of goes in waves, but you know, there was a lot of rent control laws and like the oil price control laws that created a lot of the oil shocks in the 70s, et cetera, right? And so potentially what ended up happening is as the government removed those sort of broad sort of price controls kind of state by state, it was like, okay, well, instead of dictating that, now we have these other sort of patchwork. I have no idea. I haven't looked into it.
It's the other way around, because a lot of the times like rent control and oil restrictions, those were like very specific price rules. But they only applied to those very specific conditions, right? So like the Boston rent control laws that went into the 70s, and they got rid of them in the 90s or so, or early 2000s, which like all evidence points to that having been generally a good thing because investment into real estate tripled after that, even though there's still like some obvious issues with supply for rental.
Well, and that's what was happening in Argentina, right? Where Javier Milei got rid of the rent controls and price actually went down and supply spiked like double or something like that.
I mean, that's the thing. In Boston, that was the same case, in a couple other states where that happened too, but it was short term. So that's, I think there's like the short term and the long term fallout of that. So I'm curious, like in retrospect, maybe in another 10 years when they look at like everything that happened post law, what will be the like net? Because I think right now the outcome is still considered positive in the fact that there was a lot of additional investment into Boston real estate in terms of having additional supply. Prices stayed pretty consistent for a while supply was going up. But now, I mean, Boston is similar to New York in terms of rent prices. And my understanding is that is, again, a demand and supply thing. But that can just be because there's just a finite space of Boston, right? Like at a certain point, you hit a limit to how much you can build. And at that point, then no more supply can be achieved. So at that point, price just starts going up.
Is there any other areas we haven't touched on?
Oh, there's the firefighter thing.
So going back to ancient Rome, that was referencing, so I guess in ancient Rome, the story goes that private firefighters should show up as your house was burning and negotiate the price to put out your fire in your house with you. So I think we can all agree that's not a good system. That violates the acting under duress. In that case, it's much more of a, hey, you got a nice house there. Be ashamed to see it burn down. What you want to do about it kind of feel. And I don't think anybody appreciates that level of, oh man, it's a shame your windows are so easy to break and your doors and locks are so easy to pick. You got a lot of nice stuff in here.
Yeah, you do that accent well. I do think it was interesting though, because I'm sure you saw the private firefighters in LA for certain properties that people hired, and not knowing a lot of the details, because I think a lot of people are being understandably fairly quiet about that because they don't want to share a lot of that information, which makes total sense. I think to me, this comes back to this aspect of, do you have a finite resource of something? And does your ability to pay for it and thus removing it from the general availability harm those who do not have the ability to pay for it? In this case, it becomes actually a little bit more extreme, because there's one thing from like removing ice for a trivial use versus a like life-saving use. That's one thing. But it technically doesn't make the remaining ice any less effective, right? Like the remaining ice stays the same. It's theoretically ability to keep something cold is not diminished. But in the example
they're
of
independent.
Like,
they're independent.
Yes, exactly. But in the example of removing firefighters from a team, in theory, it could make the remaining firefighters less effective at their job, right? If these are active firefighters who are choosing,
or if they're trying to use the hydrants and all the hydrants are low on pressure.
Exactly, right? So you're essentially making the public good less effective for everyone else by removing things from it. If you're talking about like retired firefighters or off-duty people who are using personal equipment, all that kind of stuff, so that your hiring of them has zero impact on everyone's access to the remaining firefighting force, I'm like, sure, go for it. If you can afford it, be my guest. If we're talking about it being in a system where you are actively recruiting firefighters who otherwise would be like out in the wildfires fighting in the forest, which would then prevent it from coming into the city, then I think what you're doing is you're actually diminishing the societal impact here for your own personal gain. What
So-
these were?
I don't know either. Well, I think one person who has been public around it is Rick Caruso, the guy who ran for mayor against Karen Bass, because he had the store or the mall in the Palisades was the only thing that didn't burn down, because he had a private fire team who came in with water tanker trucks and sprayed the whole place down like during the event. But yeah, I don't know like what were those people doing otherwise. I'm assuming he didn't just grab other LA fire department people, be like, hey, why don't you come over here and do this thing? I have no idea, so I won't speak to it. That does have some amount of rhyming with the argument that we have over like vouchers for private schools, right? Which is, hey, if you allow people to take their tax money and put it towards this, right, you're taking money from public schools towards private schools, right? And then that further deteriorates the public services, right? There's probably ways that it's incredibly different that I'm not appreciating in the moment. I don't know what I think about it either.
It felt, my initial gut reaction was just like, that feels icky. I can't like necessarily, because I don't know enough of the details to really do the like full assessment of it. It just like inherently looking at it, it feels weird if it is truly detracting from the public good that in theory should be accessible to everyone. Like, honestly, this would be a very extreme example, but if you're on a boat that's going down and you were to be like, well, I can pay for a life raft for myself and I don't want anyone else on it. There are limited life rafts. There are a set number of people that are trying to get off this boat. And by you buying out this life raft and saying the other 11 people that could have been on there with you do not get access, that feels weird, right? That does not feel like it should be the case. If you're looking at life rafts coming off of a boat, all passengers should be treated equally at that point, right? Like, just because you bought the presidential suite on the cruise ship doesn't mean you get one life raft all to yourself when 11 other people could be on there with you. That's what I mean when it comes to this moral imperative. If we're all in this situation together, we should all be kind of trying to help ourselves and each other survive this. I do feel like it would be very weird for someone to take an entire life for themselves when other people could survive by joining it.
You're making very good points. I have no argument with that whatsoever. I don't know what you do about the public-private resources in that regard. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Anything else that we didn't touch on that you want to touch on?
No, I thought it was good. It was a little weird to just take one point of view basically the whole time, because I felt like I was trying to play a little bit of the counterpoint to you, just to keep the conversation going a bit. But I feel like I'm probably going to get some hate comments from people who do not like that standpoint. But that's always fun. No, I think the only other thing, and it's like worth sharing because I really love it a lot, the 5 levels that you called out for strategy and tactics, which like I hadn't seen since college when I studied it, but it's like good to see it again.
Well, let's just kind of quickly narrate over it. So the one thing was strategy and tactics of pricing. So obviously we've both read it, kind of Bible of pricing out there, Tom Nagel, and was it Reed Holden who's the co-author on it, I think? But so brilliant book for anyone who's really serious about the topic. But he has a chapter on laws and ethics. And so he outlined sort of 5 different levels of ethical transactions in a market. And so level 1 is prices paid voluntarily. This is caveat emptor, buyer beware. 2 people are brought together, they can transact, ultimate freedom, laissez-faire markets. Kind of level 2 adds a requirement. It's based on equal information. I know something about the good that you don't know, and so we at least have to have equal information.
All disclosures, etc.
All disclosures, etc. And so, and third is does not exploit a buyer's essential needs, and I think that's where a lot of this conversation was today, right? Is Uber an essential need? Is shelter? Is water? So this level of ethical requirement prevents you from making excessive, unconscionable, unreasonable profits on life-saving pharmaceuticals, right? And we could probably say this is probably where Martin Shkreli got dragged through the woods, right, for raising the price of pharmaceuticals. Rightly or wrongly, I didn't pay enough attention. And so level 4 would be, are they justified by the costs, right? So you don't get to have excess pricing based on even non-essential goods, right? Yes, of course, businesses have to be able to stay in business. So we equate them some profit margin, but they're not allowed to collect what you might term excess rents, where, hey, like I'm making above and beyond what is considered reasonable, even for non-essential products. And then finally would be more the Marxist socialist view. Suppliers are required to provide equal access to goods regardless of their ability to cover the cost. So this is from each according to his ability to each according to their need. And so there's no exchange for personal gain allowed. Everyone sort of works for the benefit of society. And so I think it was a good frame. I agree. I saw it. I was like, this helps to kind of, like I said, people just emotionally sort of react of like good, bad, this people's evil, this is greedy, right? But we don't have this sort of nuanced way of understanding. Okay, which level are we talking about? Is it because it's an essential? Are we just complaining because I couldn't get home from the bar on New Year's Eve for a reasonable cost? Or is this because somebody couldn't get some life-saving water, right, or shelter in a dire emergency? And it gives us a little bit more of a ladder to think through. Any comments you want to make on that?
No, I mean, I think like I actually kind of just wish we could just give that book and even just that chapter to most state governments and be like, just define the rules based on this, because it's very clearly laid out in terms of what level of a state are we? Are we a level 1 state? Are we a level 3 state? Are we a level 5 state? Like, where are we at here? Because if you tell us and then you just define what excessive means, I think that's like the one vague concept there of what do you mean by excessive profits? I'm a much bigger fan of talking about the profit aspect versus the revenue aspect, because I do think that just solves the whole costing supply chain stuff. Then I think you get into a very reasonable place. There's like a lot of little nuances you can introduce into these laws, right? There are plenty of laws that don't apply to small businesses if they have less than 25 employees, for instance, or they make less than a certain amount of money every year, right? There's a lot of things we could say where like price gouging laws only impact businesses of this size and above. They don't impact small businesses. So there's a whole bunch of things you could do to make this more nuanced and easier. But I think to your point, it's all about the transparency and being able to communicate this and understand this so that we know what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And
Versus
then for
just these are evil capitalists trying to be greedy. Well, yeah, no, I completely agree. Well, and it also helped me think through a lot of points, and that's what these are for. So, any parting words?
just that I hope we don't have any more natural disasters where this is going to become a topic of conversation. So fingers crossed for that.
All right. Well, I think that's a very pragmatic / optimistic way to end it. So
Very optimistic.